Let's begin. Welcome to all who are with us. I'm Brinkley Messick. I'm professor of anthropology and I'm director of the Middle East Institute, and I was one of the founders of the Center for Palestine Studies. This is a further session in our series on readings in Khalidiyya. This is based on the Khalidi library having been digitized recently, a fact which we celebrated in the opening session in October. And this was digitized by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and making the manuscripts much more accessible. And we wanted to both celebrate that and also think of the opportunities that digitization presents. These readings in the Khalidiyya are sponsored by the Center for Palestine Studies, which is in its 10th year, and which has an interest in the history of Palestine. And this library is a remarkable resource for that kind of thinking. It's also sponsored by the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, which, unlike the Center for Palestine Studies, which is in its 10th year and still the unique such center in the United States, the new Center for the Study of Muslim Societies is about a year old. The sessions of the readings are also sponsored by the Khalidi Library itself, which has a new website, which I suggest you take a look at, and also by both the libraries at both Columbia University and NYU. Our first speaker today is Boris Liebrenz, who is a senior researcher at the Saxon Academic Academy of Sciences and Humanities, under the rubric of a project on Bibliotheca Arabica. He has a PhD from the University of Leipzig in Arabic philology. His research interests are, and I'll read just quickly, Arabic codicology, Arabic papyrology, history of reading in libraries, history of medicine and sciences, Ottoman social and economic history, and digital humanities. Among his writings, he has a book on Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts in Leipzig, and I think a book also that I think is the product of his dissertation, his PhD thesis on the Rifaiya Library in Damascus, a private Ottoman-era library. He has also edited a volume, this is among many other works, a history of books and collections through manuscript notes, a topic that's fits with the presentation today, which is on, his title is Of Waqfs and Worms, the Khalidiya through its manuscript notes. Following his presentation, we'll have comments by Marina Rustow, who's the Khaduri A. Zilcha Professor of Near Eastern Studies and Professor of History at Princeton University. She's also the director of the Manuscript, Rare Books, and Archive Studies at Princeton, and is the director also of the Princeton Geniza Lab. Her books include a recent one called The Lost Archive, which is, and the subtitle is Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue. Another book, Heresy and the Politics of Community, the Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate. She too, as with Boris, is very interested in digital scholarship. Again, the title of the talk today that will be commented on by Marina is Of Waqfs and Worms, the Khalidiyya through its manuscript notes. Boris Librence, please, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brinkley, and thanks a lot to the Center for Palestine Studies for inviting me to this wonderful lecture series. Many thanks also to the Himmel Library and their efforts to digitize the Khalidiyya, also obviously to the Khalidi family and their great efforts. Without them, I would not have been able to familiarize myself through the last several months with the manuscripts of the Khalidiyya, and which has been a pleasure. I must have really grown to like this collection a lot. And I'm very grateful that I can now today share some of my findings and thoughts about this library with you. Let me share my presentation with you, which should be on your screens right now. And there's a lot of, right. So in this talk, in this reading of the Khalidiyya, I will not concentrate on precisely how the Khalidiyya came to be and develop, because Konrad Hirschler has already given us a lot of material in his excellent lecture with documentary evidence that I have no access to. Rather, I seek to show how manuscript notes connect this library to the greater world of books as it developed over the centuries and how we can use them. So I will repeatedly reach back to the time before a certain volume came to the hands of a Khalidi. As Konrad Hirschler has already pointed out, in the case of this collection, we luckily have many documentary sources at our disposal. That is usually not the case when one wants to write the history of a library. When it comes to deciphering the meaning of the Khalidiyya, so to speak, its roots and development and usage over time, manuscript notes ought to be one major source. Over the past couple of months, I have cataloged the notes in roughly 900 volumes of the Khalidiyya, which is the larger part of this collection. But more than 300 volumes still need to be combed through. So my following thoughts are raw, preliminary, and sometimes impressionistic. And before I get into them, I want to start by asking, what do I mean when I say manuscript notes? Or a bit more poetically, what are and to what end do we study manuscript notes? This is probably a title more for the German listeners who will hopefully recognize the inaugural lecture of Schiller, and when he started his professorship as an historian, actually. The famous poet was actually a fellow historian. And for those who do not recognize that, doesn't matter. But I think what Schiller and our approach has in common, he wanted to have a new look at history back in his days, you know, in 250 years ago. And manuscript notes actually allow us to do the same, to have a new look at the history of libraries, which has been at the center of scholarly attention for a while now, really, for a long time, but has usually over the centuries been told with literary sources usually. And in the past decades, in the past years, actually, what we have come to get more and more is the use of documentary sources for the writing of the history of the book and the libraries and reading. And one of those major sources is manuscript notes. So what do I mean with that? I think I have to clarify that, because usually when I say I'm working with manuscript notes, people tend to understand that in the way that they, of the material that they like to work with usually. And so I find that most people, when they hear that, they think about marginalia, because usually as an Arabist, you engage with a text, and then the notes that you would encounter are the notes that engage with that text. On the margin of the text, they comment on the text, they explain the text, and so manuscript notes are usually understood as that. Or people understand them as ijazat, which is the one kind of manuscript note that has really had a long, several decades now of scholarly attention. But what I'm rather referring to are documentary texts with concrete information in terms of names, dates, or places about the use or the legal status of a manuscript. And the most prevalent among them are ownership notes, reading notes, by which I mean private reading, transmission notes, usually called samaat or ijazat, also kira'at, endowment notes. There are patronage notes. So if somebody ordered a manuscript to be copied, to come into existence, there are vendors notes, copying, which can happen usually in the form of colophons, but also in other kind of notes. Borrowing and lending. There are seals which cover a lot of what has been said above. They can refer to endowments or ownership or other things. And birth and death notes, because they usually give you a date that can put a certain manuscript into context. What I do not usually mean are all other kinds of miscellanea. You know that everybody has dealt with Arabic manuscripts, knows that they are usually covered with all kinds of writings that are not the actual literary text that is on the title page, but all other kinds of things that you also find on flyleaves or in between. And these could be recipes, accounts, historical notes, biographies, autobiographical things, fatwas, poetry, everything that's somehow useful, called for wide, or even just somebody writing about the weather. And those are usually not what I take. When I catalog, I usually transcribe everything, all the notes, like in full text. But what I don't take are these kind of notes, unless in the case that you see here, this is a recipe, which is usually something that I would not catalog. But in this case, the guy who wrote it actually subscribed. He says, Katabahu al-Mamluk, Ali Baya Saifi Yashbak. So in this case, I have a name to it, and then I would catalog it. But in any other instance, these are the things that we don't take, because what I want to do is I want to work with a database, and you need some concrete information in order to get that into a database. Now what I do is I go to a library usually, and I say, can I see please all your manuscripts? And then I go through all of these manuscripts and then transcribe all those manuscript notes that I've mentioned above. Because to have the full text methodologically is very important for me, not just to say, oh, there is an ownership note of such and such, but to actually have the full text. And that can, depending on that note, mean actually a lot of writing, because some of the notes are pretty short. They just say, this is from the books of such and such. But you can have notes like this, where what you see in the middle is not a literary text. This is an ownership note. It fills the whole page, complete with witnesses at the bottom, you see. So this is a complete legal document. And around that note, like in the margin of it, you see an endowment note, again with witnesses and everything. So again, a complete legal document. So you can have you can transcribe several pages sometimes. Sometimes it's not that much, but yeah, sometimes you have to work for the information. There is the question of preservation, and when we talk about manuscript notes, a lot of them have been lost. So we can never expect to have the full picture. If we go through, we can still go through hundreds of thousands of manuscripts today, and we can find hundreds of thousands of manuscript notes to analyze, but we must be aware that a lot of them have been lost. As in this case, deliberate destruction. Here, they have just been crossed out. Good story is, very often, if you actually look at the manuscript, if you go to the manuscript and apply a different light and everything, you can probably still read some key material in there. But some are just lost forever. And you can, what comes to mind, there are also literary anecdotes, such as the one of Al-Qadi al-Fadil, the famous vizier of Saladin, who, when the Fatimid libraries were dissolved, wanted to get his portion of that of those libraries by allegedly, according to the sources, having from all those wonderful manuscripts, having the book covers ripped off and the title pages ripped off, so that the real value of these books was not anymore apparent, and he could get them for a cheaper price. Now, whether or not that's true, what we can imagine is that that happened actually a lot. That many of the manuscripts have lost their title pages, have lost the pages where we have this kind of information, and they are they are lost. But we can't. So that you see that with a lot of manuscripts where they have new title pages. Luckily for us, paper as a commodity was used in reused in so many different ways that we can probably salvage some of those things. So we don't have much information about the history of the about actual manuscripts from the Fatimid libraries. I suspect that a lot of them are actually in the libraries today, but we can't recognize them because they would have lost their manuscript notes. The pages that would have been lost from those manuscripts could have been reused in bindings, for example, in textiles, in all kinds of other reuse situations. Or they would have been just put probably into something like Geniza. And I was very happy to see in Marina Rustow's book, in this wonderful great tome, The Lost Archives, there she has, from the Cairo Geniza, a bifolio that was a splendid manuscript from the Fatimid library, and where you have here on the left side a one-page manuscript note in which basically the heir apparent of the Fatimid Caliphate says to one of his underlings, "You've served us well, have this book." And then it's, if I understand correctly, and then it's it even has these wonderful marks of bureaucracy in which this has to be marked in the archives, you know, that this book was actually given away, and this text would have been probably recopied into some archival other form of preservation. So we find that in some of the libraries that have, like the Khalidiyya, have a dasht, you know, where just some pages are there, where we just have a title page probably, and then you can see, oh, or you find it as find a title page of a book reused as a flyleaf in another book, and then you can see, oh, there was this book once, and we have a we have some ownership notes on there, so we know that this book once was in that library. Even if the book doesn't exist anymore, we can have like something like a phantom volume that we can still in a database of literature. We can still put it there. We know it once existed, even though we don't have the text anymore. So I just want to say some words about digital work, because that is obviously a necessity these days, but it's also a great blessing for us. So as I said, what I've done with the Khalidiyya was purely digital. I've never been to Jerusalem. I've never seen those volumes, but I could work with them. Again, a great thanks to the Khalidi family and Himmel, who have done amazing work in putting these things online. As I said, digital work is really a blessing. However, I would still always stress that going to the libraries, seeing the actual manuscripts is still a necessity. Because if you imagine the work that you're just seeing here on the screen, if you would work with that on the screen, you would just immediately see, wow, a wonderful Mamluk volume. This was probably in the library of some sultan, Mamluk sultan at some point. It's from an artistic point of view, it's just beautiful. And you might think this must have a wonderful history too, you know, but there is no sign of it on the page. So unfortunately, you would have to go on, and no information coming out of there. But if you actually went to see this library, this manuscript in Leiden, where it is today, you could then hold the page against the sun, and you see, oh yeah, there is a lot of information. It just has been glued over with a new page, you know, leaving the actual Mamluk, the fine calligraphy and the fine illumination from the Mamluk era intact, but this Ottoman era ownership note that you see on the lower left side and the Waqf note that you see on the upper side has been obscured for, you know, maybe for reasons of somebody didn't want to know that this was once a Waqf, or this was once in the possession of someone else. The point is, in digital world, you wouldn't have known that. And actually, when I put together this slide, I thought I'd end it here, lesson learned. But having reviewed the slide just yesterday, I think, I saw, oh, this is actually a Khalidi that we are seeing here. So if you're looking at the ownership note on the lower left side, this is a man whose name is Ubaydullah bin Abdullah al-Shahir bi Baha'uddin Zadeh al-Umari al-Khalidi. This is a family called Baha'uddin Zadeh, who were also Khalidis, that a lot of their manuscripts have come to Leiden through Levinus Varna, who bought a lot of them in Constantinople. So they are like the Khalidis of Jerusalem. They combine an affiliation to Umar al-Khattab, that's why they call themselves al-Umari, the Caliph, and to Khalid ibn al-Walid, that's why they call themselves al-Khalidi. So two men, by the way, who, if we are to trust the historical sources, couldn't really get along well with each other, but in the name of these families, they are combined. And that's, as I said, that's exactly what the Khalidis also did. They are calling themselves al-Khalidi mostly, but also al-Umari and they trace their ancestry back to these two men. And just today, actually, by chance, by just going through my notes, I saw that, yeah, one of them, so this is the brother of this Ubaydullah. This is Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Lutfullah bin Baha'uddin al-Shahir ibn Baha'uddin Zadeh. This is in the Khalidiyya. So one of them, that family's volumes also came to Jerusalem to the Khalidiyya family. In this note, it's not clear that this is also a Khalidi from Constantinople, right? So names are fluid. You can always, you cannot always see all the elements of them. The question is, you know, if our Khalidis from Jerusalem, if they come to Constantinople and meet this guy, would they recognize each other as part of the same family? Maybe, probably not. But they are, you know, I thought it's an interesting coincidence. Now, the point again that I was just making is we need to see the actual manuscripts, and that's a necessity not only for aesthetic beauty, but you know, for the information that we want to get out of them. But now this was a little precursor to working with the Khalidi manuscripts. Now this is called readings in the Khalidiyya. So let's read. And the first thing that I want to show is obviously that manuscript notes that we see on all these books bear innumerable stories, that they are usually mute, and it is our task to make them speak. I want to demonstrate now two basic concepts for doing that and for working with manuscript notes that I call entanglement and context. And I want to start by showing this beautiful title page for the very famous Kitab Tawq al-Hamama, the neck ring of the dove. One, you know, as far as Arabic works, or especially medieval Arabic works go, this is, you know, one of the most relevant still today, you know, translated in all major languages, numerous editions. This is a real superstar among Arabic texts still. And as most of you might know, also, it survived in only one manuscript, and that manuscript today is in Leiden and not in the Khalidiyya. So why am I bringing this up? Bear with me, because that is precisely the point. I want to concentrate among the many manuscript notes that you're seeing here, and I will analyze them in a publication very soon. But among the very many manuscript notes, I want to actually concentrate on just one of them. And it's not one of those that I listed above. It's not an ownership note, not a readership note, not any of that. It's actually just a poem. Not just, it's a poem. This poem tells us, as you can see up here, the writer tells us that he wrote this poem. So this is not just a poem of someone else that he copied, but something that he wrote. It says, Likatibihi Ali Marisas al-Hanafi. Not al-Rassas, al-Risas, actually, in this case. And then he pens a poem that he devised on love, which is also the theme of the book, the Tawq al-Hamama. This is a book on love and lovers. So he doesn't say that he read the book, but he engages with the book in a poetic way. So we can assume he actually read the book. You know, he's kind of talking to it poetically. And I didn't know really who that guy was. There were in the sources, there were two people who would fit the description: Ali Marisas al-Hanafi, who lived at the lifetime of this volume of the Tawq al-Hamama. One died in 803, and he was a judge in Safad. I thought initially that was the guy, because the original owner of the Tawq al-Hamama, and presumably also its copyist, was also a judge in Safad. So that made sense. You know, it would have stayed in Safad, one judge giving it to the next judge, it would have made sense. Another Ali ibn Marisas that we also find in the sources lived much later. He died like 8 centuries after this one that I originally thought was the one. He died in the 880s, and he was a scholar, a legal scholar in Jerusalem, and headed some madrasas in Jerusalem and also in Hebron, in Al-Khalil. but as I said, I thought it was the first one. I couldn't really figure it out though. Now in play comes the Khalidiyya, because here in one of the Khalidiyya manuscripts, number 328, on folio 6 verso, I actually find a marginal note. You know, I'm actually talking more about marginal notes here than I usually do. I find a marginal note in which someone answers a legal question. So this is a legal manuscript, and it's about ablutions and what happens when you bleed. Do you need a new ablution? Some tricky, legalistic questions involved with that. And here somebody gives a legal answer to one of those questions in the margin, and that guy is Ali Marisas al-Hanafi. So the same guy who read the Tawq al-Hamama also read this legal manual, and he, in both cases, he felt complied to engage with the manuscript, one in a poetic way and another time in a legal way. And I found that very interesting in itself. It also allows us to really identify this person, because the Khalidiyya manuscript is actually copied after the older Ali Marisas that I thought, the judge of Safed, that I thought was the one after he died. So it must be the next one. It must be the guy from Jerusalem, which also makes sense. We have him here in a manuscript that is still in Jerusalem. So that allows us to really flesh out the lives of these readers more than those notes themselves allow us to do. You know, it's the note itself doesn't say when it was written. It doesn't say who wrote it, who the person really was who wrote it. But we can add additional material, and we can make these entanglements, these connections between different works that we would probably not think about together. We don't think about the Tawq and think about legal works, and we don't think about this Hanafi legal work and think about the Tawq al-Hamama, a book of poetry and of adab. So, but in the daily life, in the reading biographies of these people, we can combine them actually, and that's something that the manuscript notes allow us much more than the literary notes. Like the biographies of these people don't usually allow us to do that. They don't tell you what they actually read. Sometimes they tell you they had a lot of books, they loved books, something like that, in a very vague way, but they don't say really precisely. And the manuscript notes, they allow us to do that. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is, again, a marginal note. As I said, this is very unusual for me, but in the margin of this Khalidiyya manuscript in number 7, you find a reaction to a point in that in this legal work where somebody says, you know, it just doesn't copy an explanation from another work, but he says akulus. So he says something on his own terms about comments on his own about this work, and then he gives his comments, he gives references to other books, and then says in the end, yatharu laka dhalika al-faqir khairuddin. So the guy who wrote this is khairuddin. Not much information there. That's actually the point of why marginal notes are usually not in my purview, because usually they're not subscribed, they are not, they don't tell you who wrote them or when or anything. You can't really localize them. They're very hard to work with, to contextualize. And if they are subscribed, it's often in a way that you find here, Khairuddin. Who is that? When did he live? We don't know. Fortunately, though, this is the manuscript's title page. Late Ottoman, probably late Mamluk, early Ottoman, probably. And luckily, what we have preserved here is an ownership note on the title page. And if we look at that, what we find is Khairuddin al-Hanafi al-Ramli. So this is the guy. It's a bit destroyed, but readable. Written over an older note, by the way. So there's more history that has been destroyed by this note. But still, Khairuddin al-Hanafi al-Ramli. And that's not just someone, this is one of the greatest jurists of 17th century Ottoman period. This is such an important figure, not only for Palestine, but really his influence in the Arab world or on the Ottoman legal system is immense. You know, it's very profound. So this is a very interesting find. Not only because we have here an instance where we cannot just just say somebody owned a book, but we can also see how he read it, how he reacted to it. And in the Khalidiyya, we have this Khairuddin actually in marginal notes in no less than 7 manuscripts, and only 2 of them have Khairuddin Ramli's ownership note. So without that connection that we are making here between those notes, we could not say who that Khairuddin was in many of those volumes, and that's why what I mean by context. Very often you have something where you have a bare name, just Ahmed or Khairuddin, but you can add context from all kinds of different sources, from other manuscript notes, from biographical dictionaries, from other documentary sources, and then paint a fuller picture. And that is really what we need to do. Now the question is, why did so many of Khairuddin Ramli's books actually come to the Khalidiyya? Also of his son Najmuddin, there were several books in the Khalidiyya. And the answer to that could be just regional. I mean, he was in Ramla, which is very close to Jerusalem. And if you have, it's a small world, it's a small book market. If you're buying up a lot of books, chances are you get some of Khairuddin's books, because he also had a large library. But there is probably more to it, since the Khalidis were not only referring to themselves as descendants of Omar ibn al-Khattab, the caliph, and not only to Khalid ibn al-Walid, the military man, but also very proudly referred to themselves as descendants of Khairuddin Ramli. Here in this ownership note, Muhammad al-Khalidi refers to himself as Sibt al-Khair al-Ramli al-Faruqi. And actually this Faruqi they do very often, and I always thought it was a reference to Omar ibn al-Khattab, who was Faruq, but it could also be a reference to Khairuddin Ramli, who is also al-Faruqi. Yeah, we have this genealogical entanglement that could have led to several of the volumes that are now in the Khalidiyya. How they ended up there could have been some family connections. We don't know it actually. Now with Ali ibn Risas and with Khairuddin Ramli, we have so far seen examples of regional connections, as both of these men were scholars in Palestine. But one of the remarkable aspects of the Khalidiyya, when compared with other regional libraries of the 18th and 19th century, and also before, is actually the trans-regional scale we find in the provenance of the collection. This shows that the Khalidis of Jerusalem did not only rely on the book market of Jerusalem, rather they participated in the empire-wide peripatetic class of high ulama and administrators. And that is, in their case, so this is not unusual, but their case actually is a bit unusual, because usually what we find is judges and administrators and governors coming from Constantinople, say, going to the provinces and going back home with books. So we have all these 17th and these large 17th and 18th century collections of manuscripts that are that have been established in Constantinople in that period, that still make Istanbul and Turkey as a whole like the center of Arabic manuscript studies, Arabic manuscripts in the world still today. Many of them have been assembled in that time, but it's usually people like Jarullah Effendi, like Feyzullah Effendi, like Rare Pasha, like Grand Viziers, Muftis, judges, going to the provinces through their postings into the judgeships of Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem and all that, and just going on a shopping spree, taking all the manuscripts they can get, bringing them back home, making an endowment where they stay. So this is the situation usually. We don't usually have that with judges from Jerusalem and with judges from Damascus. They might have some books from other parts of the empire, but they're mostly regional, much more so than the Khalidiyya, actually. When we look at the sources of the Khalidiyya, though, we can connect that with some of the itineraries of these Khalidi collectors. We have here, I give you here two ownership notes of two different Khalidis. One of them on the left says that he bought this, later he endowed it, but that he bought this. This is Muhammad Sun Allah al-Khalidi, and he bought it Hal al-Mujawara bil-Azhar. So while he was on his studying trip, or Mujawara can be you live at a holy site, at a site of study, while he was at the Azhar, and many Khalidis were, and then you can see on the right side that this Khalidi, this is Muhammad al-Khalidi, Sibt Umar al-Faruq, that he ordered this to be copied fi Mahrusat Istanbul. So while he was in 1197, he was in Istanbul. And these are actually those two places, the Azhar in Cairo and Istanbul, are the two places that show up most in the Khalidiyya library. The Azhar, in fact, I have worked to an incredible amount, actually. I have worked with the Gotha collection. For example, I cataloged the manuscript notes there, and that is made up mostly of what Ulrich Jasper Seetzen had brought back from his trips, who bought a lot in Aleppo, but most of what he bought was in Cairo. Like, I think more than 1,500 works, volumes that he bought from Cairo. So it's much more from Cairo than, or should be, than in the Khalidiyya. But if I look in my file, in my Gotha file, and search for the term Al-Azhar, I find decidedly less hits than I find in my Khalidiyya file, even though that is a library from Jerusalem. They actually, and you can see why that is. You can see through those manuscript notes how they got to those manuscripts. They went to the Azhar, to Cairo, and bought a lot, or maybe not bought, and copied and had copied and got presents or whatever. And we will get to the Azhar later on a little bit more when we talk about Waqfs. At this point, I will first turn to Constantinople. And first of all, I want to show these nice seals. They are, in fact, typical seals of Ottoman sultans of the 18th century. That's what they would put in their books. They all mostly have the same kind of writing in them, the same kind of Quranic verse in them, and then at the end would have a Torah with their name. In this case, it's Mustafa. So this is the sultan that would have been called. Torahs are hard to read, but it's actually because this is a Mustafa, and the dating of the manuscripts and all. There's really only one choice, and that's Mustafa III. And you find this particular seal in no less than 7 manuscripts in the Khalidiyya. Whereas many seals are destroyed, and as you see on the right side, some look worse than that. So there might be more, and I might still find more in the rest of the collection that I haven't seen yet. But 7 volumes from a sultanic library that really shouldn't be in the Khalidiyya. Mustafa III, as you can see, he reigned from 1757 to 1774, so rather long rule. And as you can see in this picture, and this cartouche down there, remembered as, patron of sciences and books. You see some manuscripts down here, probably some of them now in the Khalidiyya. And he made, in terms of his contribution for books, many Ottoman sultans did a lot of endowments and everything. He in particular endowed, he erected a library in the palace complex, and he also endowed a large collection to the Lalali Mosque complex. And when you look at the Lalali Mosque complex, are the manuscripts that were still preserved there and that are now in the Suleymaniya. Many of them, most of them maybe, still have that seal of his that we find in the Khalidiyya library on their pages. So these were volumes that were never deaccessioned. They were always meant to be there. There was never a time when somebody had said, these they're not Waqf anymore. You can have them. They're on the market. So they could not. There was no legal way of them getting out of that library. And the other instance that I want to mention, or the other example from Istanbul that I want to mention, is this guy who has at least 4 manuscripts of his library have come to the Khalidiyya. This is someone that I have grown very fond of over the years. It's this man, Abu Bakr bin Rustam bin Ahmed al-Shirwani, has come up in several publications recently. Usually people say, oh, I have a manuscript that must have been in Shirwan because there was a guy from Shirwan, like Shirwani. And that's strange because he's among people who know manuscripts, the history of libraries, and I mean, he's become quite a famous name, I think, at this point, because his library was such an amazing, massive thing. It's if you go to the Butler Library, you will find a manuscript from his library there. Marina, if you go to the Princeton Library, obviously you have many manuscripts from Ashirwani's library there. If I go around the corner to the University Library here, I have manuscripts from his library here in Leipzig. They are everywhere. Chances are, you know, wherever you look at this from around the world, chances are you have a Shirwani manuscript very close to you, because it was just such an enormous library that got dispersed after his death, apparently, and ended up really all around the world. And that really makes it a splendid opportunity to do research, really. I want to muster a little analogy here, if I may, because what you see here has nothing to do with books, but rather with little plastic ducks like this one. This is actually a Norman warrior or Viking warrior, I think. But, you know, these kind of plastic ducks that we all know. There was, in the year 1992, there was a crate of them that got lost on the sea in the Pacific Ocean. And all of them, so that crate broke open and all of these ducklings were in the water. They don't, you know, they float. So over the years, they turn up at the coast somewhere. And that apparently, the way they have turned up over the years and where they have turned up apparently has allowed oceanographers, I don't know how you call that, to chart the currents of the sea that I assumed would just be common knowledge, but apparently that is not the case. You don't know when you drop something in the water somewhere where it would pop up. And those floating things apparently allowed scientists to chart the currents of the sea. I don't know how much scientific value that actually had. It sounds a bit crude to me, but I found that very nice analogy, and I want to replicate that actually with books. Only the thing that I want to chart are not the currents of a large body of water, but of the book market. If you imagine the library of Abu Bakr al-Shirwani as a crate full of books, and then you pop it open in Constantinople at a certain point when he was there, when he died, and then you see where they pop up, in which libraries. For example, in Jerusalem at a certain point, four volumes in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in Leipzig, in all around the world. Then you can actually see the currents of the book market. You know, where's the draw? Where would things end up? And that's actually, I intend to do that actually in my next monograph, which will center Ashirwani as really in my view, the arch bibliophile of that age. It's not the Sultans or, you know, people with much more means didn't have libraries like he had. But he was a unique specimen, and some of them are also in the Khalidiyya. Now I want to, going away from those from Constantinople, I will now want to enter the complicated issue of endowment notes. Endowments are always a thorny issue, not only because from the beginning, really from the earliest time that books were produced in the Islamic world, there was the issue: can they even be endowed? They are movable items. They can something like that be endowed when in theory an endowment should last forever and it could not be removed. So there was always this kind of legal discussion of books and endowments. How do they fit? But at the time that we are talking about here, endowments were a very common thing for books. Many libraries were actually endowed, as the Khalidiyya, as others too. In the previous talk by Konrad Hirschler, he already hinted at the library of Ahmed Pasha Al-Jazar, for example, for a contemporary comparison. Someone who, a Pasha, a ruler who endowed his mosque in the end of the 18th century with a very precious library. And I recently read in an upcoming soon to be published article by Garrett Davidson, who researched the history of Princeton's manuscript collection, and Abraham Yehuda, who is the major source for that collection. And he went through the letters of Abraham Yehuda and found that Yehuda went to Akka, where this library was endowed, and saw that, oh, there are some splendid manuscripts here, I want to have them. And apparently he could, because I found in Dublin and in Princeton several of Al-Jazar's endowed specimens that apparently ended up with Yehuda. Among them, this famous manuscript of the Fihris that Konrad showed in the last talk. So what does that have to do with the Khalidiyya? When we look at this manuscript, for example, from the Khalidiyya, we find something very similar. There is a seal, and it was a Waqf seal, and it has been destroyed. And you may ask, why is that? Now, there's not much to see there, but fortunately, I know this seal very well. It actually graces the cover of one of my books. And this is, in fact, the seal of Ahmed Pasha Al-Jazar. So you have, from that contemporary library, not far from Jerusalem, you have something that was a functioning Waqf, that was a functioning library, and still it ended up in the Khalidiyya. By the way, another one, I think that is probably also Ahmed Pasha Al-Jazar seal, much less there's no script visible here really to speak of, but I think from the form and the shape, I think it might be his, but it's less clear than here. Here it's clear, this is Ahmed Pasha Al-Jazar. So this has happened all the time. I can find his seal not only in Dublin and Princeton and in the Khalidiyya, but also in many other collections. And I can often show that it took only a few years for such a collection, as splendid as it was, as much endowment as it did have, to have librarians and people to guard them, for the books to spill out. This is something that was just a part of the history of many of these institutions, and of the book market. And we find that in other contexts in the Khalidiyya too. This, for example, is a very interesting case, because what we find often is that these endowed works have many layers of history to them. It's not just like they were endowed and then taken out of an endowment or something. What we have here, if I read to you the beginning of this endowment note, وقف وقف وقفه المرحوم جوزي جنات النعيم على مدرسة بمدينة القدس الشريف وقت, and there is actually a verb that has been eaten away by worms. ما كتب عليه وطلعت لما عال إلي إلى ملكي بالابتياع الشرعي إنه وقف وقد أبقيته على وقفه وثوابه لواقفه المرحوم. Now, what does that say? This is a strange text for an endowment note, really. I've never seen something that is really worded like that. But what it does say is that somebody actually bought this manuscript, not knowing that it was a Waqf, and then only found out, oh, this is a Waqf. And now he wants to restitute it to the endowment. But he doesn't name the endowment. He doesn't name the man who originally endowed it. And that's probably, I think, because he doesn't know. He only saw the traces of the Waqf. Namely, when you look under this endowment, you see it's written over another endowment note that we can't really read anymore, but it's from the shape of it and everything. This was a long endowment note, just like the one. And that's probably what he could also see. He could see, oh, this has been endowed before. I don't know where, but let's better not keep it in my possession, but give it to an institution. He does also not say which institution. And in fact, we also don't know who he was, because his name, as you can see here, is also again destroyed. They didn't destroy the whole Waqfiyya, and that's probably because the Waqfiyya that was under it was already erased. So I don't think that the paper would have sustained, another erasure. Probably would have been too thin at that point. But the name at least was completely erased. So we don't know who did that. But what we do know is that also that second wish, the madrasa, give it to a madrasa again, was also not followed, because then comes Muhammad Sunna al-Khalidi again and says, no, this should be a waqf for my people, for my children. I don't know how he got his hands on it. Might just have been taken out of whatever madrasa it was in, might have been on the book market, and he would have said, I don't know where to put this, so better make it a waqf myself. So we don't know that context, but you can see that these things have multiple layers very often, and we can't really just say that something there is today. I hear that quite often actually. People come and say, oh, and when there is a waqf note or there is a seal or anything, it has to go back to that institution, and there's a lot of merit to that. That's that when we obviously things have been stolen, things have been wrongfully taken, but we cannot also forget that taking things out of a waqf onto the book market, re-endowing it, this kind of lively, multi-layered history to all these books has been a part of the book market for centuries. This is not something that has been, today when we can see, oh, something has been taken out of the Egyptian National Library and it ends up at Sotheby's. Of course, you have to give it back, but when something goes back to so many layers, it's sometimes you don't even know where to give it to, It's like, at which point, it's a very complicated question. And a question that obviously also led to the destruction of many of these books. This is the one note that has been destroyed, I think, more often than any other kind of note. All of them at some point have seen destruction, but more waqfs than any other, I think. But what we do find in the Khalidiyya are sometimes destroyed waqf notes, and sometimes you have something like this, where Musa al-Mawlawi endowed something, endowed this volume, and actually also others with it, to an institution, and that's the Riwaq al-Shawam, which is also where the Khalidi studied, in 1152, and he did in Cairo, in the Azhar. So this was not destroyed. This didn't stay there. Somebody took it to the Khalidiyya, but didn't think, I have to obscure that fact. It's all right, I can leave it. And it's clearly visible. We have many of these kind of notes in the Khalidiyya. They are often destroyed, and sometimes they are not. So it's kind of a mystery. And then my last example for the waqf part, I think, comes from a Khalidi himself, who, as we can see up here, this is Sun al-Khalidi again, who bought this in while he was on his mujawara at the Azhar. So he was in Cairo, he was studying there, and in 63, he bought this book at the Azhar, and then he endows it, which is usual. He often buys books and then endows them, but he does endow that actually to the Riwaq al-Shawam, to the where the students study at the Azhar library, at the Azhar mosque. So he doesn't go back with that thing to Jerusalem and endows it there, but endows it in Cairo a year after that. So that's 1164. But still, he didn't. I suppose that he took it to Jerusalem again, or somebody else, but I guess it would have been him. So he didn't leave it there, although that the waqf in theory is for eternity. But he went against the rules of his own endowment and brought it back to Jerusalem. Interesting facts. Like these are the many convoluted stories of endowments that we see throughout this collection. And yeah, so it makes straightforward answers to, you know, what does an endowment mean also for the thorny questions of restitution and everything. It makes it much harder, you know? And now finally we come to the worms, you know, that I promised in this in my title. And in fact, we stay a little bit with the Waqf, because this was a Waqf note that apparently has not been destroyed by a human hand, but by worms. And before anybody comments in the Q&A, I know these are not actually worms. These are the larvae of several insects, but not worms. But the fact is they do destroy a lot. They eat the paper and they leave holes like this. So one point I'm making is it's not only the human danger to these books, you know, humans do destroy a lot, but it's also natural disasters that do destroy a lot of these books. And another point is that I was so surprised that Khalidiyya was actually so worm-eaten as I have actually never seen before. And I wondered why that is. I had previously I had an impression from one encounter with manuscripts that Alois Sprenger bought in India. You know, I've gone through the Berlin collection, like thousands of manuscripts in all collections, all in a pristine state, more or less. But then there is this one collection, the Sprenger collection, who bought a lot in Damascus and many places. But those that he bought from India are all worm-eaten. So I thought, okay, so this is an Indian thing. It's probably climate. It's probably, you know, it might have been something regional. And then I see this library from Jerusalem that is even worse. That is there are so many volumes that when you go on the Himmel page and you look at the overview, the thumbnail overview of these pages, a lot of that is you see something like that where it says this page is missing, where the page I think is not actually missing, but I can't open it because it's so worm-eaten. If you would open a page like that, you would just destroy it. And there are sometimes whole codices that are like 90% invisible to us because you can't be opened. Yeah, and that's just a question of mine. Why is that? You know, what happened to that library? What happened in the history of that library? Something that I'm just curious about. And I also want to draw probably one lesson of looking at these all these wormholes and the destruction that they created, and that is that we, as historians, we need to be kind of the anti-worms. We need to reverse that. We have to look at that and still get as much information out of these things as we possibly can before these manuscripts. These manuscripts are always in danger, even today. You know, we need to preserve them through digitization. We need to read them. We need to read the information that we find in them. We need to fill the holes. You know, we need to by reading these fragmentary things, by connecting the threads between all those manuscript notes throughout the collections, between Leiden and the Khalidiyya, between the Tawq al-Hamama and the legal manual. We need to do all that. We need to have all that information, put it in a database, build up the infrastructure, the tools that we need to answer the kind of questions that we have for those books, and that are not always the questions of what is written in this text, but what do they have? What can these artifacts tell us about the history? And I just want to end with a plea to build up those tools, something that we at the Bibliotheca Arabica project want to do with the limited means that we have. But I know that many other initiatives are also on this case and want to do that and want to help with that. We need to continue in that, and through the many means that are necessary, among other things, the digitization and cataloging, as the Khalidi family and the Himmel Library have so exemplary done in this project, which has allowed me to share some of my thoughts with you today. And I thank you for listening. But Brinkley, you are still
You're muted, Frank.
Thank you, Boris. Very, very rich tour of book markets and manuscripts, and we'll come back and have some discussion. But immediately we're going to have Marina Rustow offer some comments. Please, Marina.
Thank you, Boris, for an absolutely riveting talk. You know, one's always worried as a commentator, like, what if I don't have any questions? I've actually never had so many questions after a talk, so I'll try to restrict myself to just a few. So, as you know, the subject of manuscripts as objects, as opposed to just containers for text, is something that's very dear to my heart. Although I haven't worked on codices at all, so this is like a new world for me. Manuscript notes, I think, are probably a classic example of something that would not originally have been seen as increasing the interest of a work, or at least not until recently. So it's a kind of classic example of what media scholars call remediation, where suddenly something that you took for granted seems completely fascinating. So, you know, an example in our world would be like old photographs, old photography, an obsolete technology that becomes suddenly completely, you know, fetishized. And I can see why. I can totally see the reasons for it. The fact that you've drawn actually a typology of marginal notes is extremely useful, because it's very difficult for those of us kind of in the trenches when you're just going through manuscripts in a library to understand what you're looking at and also why certain things appear in the margin. I think we would expect marginal notes to be readers' notes interacting with the text, but sometimes they're just kind of random notes, like, you know, I took my father to the bazaar today or something like that. So that's also fascinating. I would push back a little bit against the distinction that you've drawn between certain kinds of notes that interest you and others that don't, because I think probably in many cases it's not so easy to draw those lines, but I think you know that already. So I'm going to move on. The possibilities, I think, are you know, just fascinating in both directions, vertically and horizontally. Vertically, in that you can drill down through one manuscript and tell these stories that take place over time and also over many different places. But also the possibility, and this is kind of going to bring me into my questions, the possibility of reconstructing a very, very big picture of the movement of knowledge and also the social interaction with knowledge over many, many centuries and over a vast, you know, vast swath of the world's territory. So one of the things that strikes me is that people who work on manuscripts, like if you talk about medieval manuscripts, people automatically think of Europe, but actually, I mean, like an anthropologist from Mars would say, oh, this is so much more interesting than the world of Latin manuscripts, for a couple of reasons. One is that you're not dealing with manuscripts that are being written in scriptoria. You're dealing with manuscripts that in many cases aren't being commissioned to be written by professional scribes. They're either user produced or they're being copied in oral reading sessions. Literacy is much less limited in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages than it is in Europe. And also access to knowledge is much more widespread, because instead of being restricted through kind of institutional monopolies, there's this amazing kind of network effect. And you see some of that in the audition notes. And so I wonder, you know, in Europe, we also, like when people talk about manuscripts, they often talk about the kind of major watershed being the introduction of movable type. So you have this kind of bottleneck, right, where suddenly some texts will make it through the bottleneck into movable type and others remain in manuscript form. Here, I think we see a much more complicated history of changing hands. And as you said, you know, the movements go in both directions. Things go into Al-Qaf, they come out of Al-Qaf, and we don't exactly know how or why. So are there, in fact, if you want to draw a big picture, big historical watersheds that you can point to? I mean, we would, I think, immediately think of the Ottoman conquests. We would also think of, or at least before your talk, I would have, you know, the first thing I would have thought of would have been kind of the manuscript drain. For example, what Ahmed Shamsi talks about in the late 19th century, but there's also this, you know, 17th century prehistory where you have the consuls and chaplains in Istanbul and Aleppo buying up hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts. Obviously in Palestine, there's 1948. So are there other kind of big watersheds where the manuscripts tend to move in a drastic way, or is it all happening in this more kind of, you know, micro sort of networked way? And to what extent are the movements towards, like, you know, institutions or away from institutions? Can you track that? Is it possible to draw this kind of a big picture? I want to just throw out a couple more questions, and you should please feel free to like answer or ignore whichever of these you choose. Manuscripts that were formerly Ottoman Sultanic Waqf, how can you speculate on how they moved? If we were to draw a big picture map of how manuscripts moved over, you know, the past 800,000 years, is there a kind of correlation by topic over time? Are there centuries in which certain kinds of manuscripts are in demand and others aren't? Or is it not possible to really draw those kinds of conclusions yet? And then behind this question is, what are the technicalities of doing work like this? So you work with databases, and it seems to me that it would be impossible to draw any kind of conclusions about these things without databases. So to give a talk like this, how did you prepare technically? Were there searches that you did in your own databases for, you know, the word Khalidi, and then you kind of took it from there? Can you talk us through maybe the back end a little bit?
Well, thank you, Marina, for these great questions. Indeed, it's that could fill up another hour, I guess. I want to, let me start with the last question, technicalities. I do work with databases. No, I want to work with databases. That's the one. We want to build up a database where all the material that I've collected over the years in Word files at this point will be where I can just by a simple search query say, give me all the Khalidis. You know, and where also you've seen this note from the Khalidiyya, where I had this guy from the Baha'u'ddin Zada family that is also Khalidi, you know, but which I by searching for Khalidi, I wouldn't have found him, although his family name is also Al-Khalidi. So they have all these these kind of flexibility in naming themselves, which you can only so when you have a database, and then I would normalize the information, I would pool all the information from all different sources about these people, then I can say, oh, this is the same guy as this other guy that's also named Khalidi, and then it would be easy to look for those. Now to at the stage as it is at this point, for me to, if I wanted to have looked for specific Khalidis, it would have been not so easy. Luckily, I didn't. You know, I didn't. I just this is was very impressionistic. It was just I was cataloging these things, and then knowing that I will talk about them later. And whenever I found something interesting, I thought, oh, this is for the talk. Let's put it there. And it's so in that sense, it was kind of easy to prepare for this talk. But otherwise, yeah, we don't have the tools to do that at this point. And we desperately need to build them up. We are going ahead with that at the Bibliotheca Arabica project. Let's see how fast we can be. Hopefully, there will be something this or next year. You had a question about watersheds. Yes, obviously, the Ottoman conquest is a big deal, and but not only this one point in time. You know, that's not only just the Ottomans going in and then taking everything. That's not what happened. But because the power centers shifted, and that means the economic centers have shifted, and there was more money and more capital and more of all sorts in different places now, and then and manuscripts follow, and that I think has happened over the years, over the centuries with other dynasties too. You know, when there is a center with sprawling libraries in one place, and then the Mongols come, for example. It's not like this. The manuscripts are not being burned, or you know, it's not these horror stories that you sometimes hear, but they move. Obviously, yes, they. So you can see movement following certain political recalibrations. You know, that's usually not one point in time, but developments like that. You asked the Sultanic Waqfs, for example, how were they moved? In the case of Mustafa III and his endowment to the Lalali complex, for example, there is actually we have sometimes from that period, from Constantinople, Western reports of, I bribed someone to get into this library, and you have they describe how they gain access to certain books. Sometimes it's clear that they bribe people to steal books. Overall, because you also asked about the book drain to Europe, I think that is really a question of the later 19th century. And I actually don't follow Ahmed Shamsi in that. I think that is not the way he dates it to earlier periods. I think is not quite correct. I mean, this is something not like in the way that suddenly they didn't have any books anymore. They couldn't study, the certain texts anymore. That's not what happened. I mean, I think there were a lot of books coming out of Aleppo, out of Constantinople. There were these collectors. Overall, I think that didn't have much of an impact. Even if thousands of books came to Europe, of course, that is a lot, but hundreds of thousands were still in the libraries, private or institutional. The big challenge for those who wanted to have books and have access to them was obviously, were there institutions that were well funded, or did, when the funding of a Waqf dries up, these books tend to percolate to the book market, and then they go also maybe to European buyers, but also just in general to private libraries where they are not generally accessible anymore. And so there has to be some certain political stability, institutional stability, and that changes very often, obviously, with over the centuries. There was something you asked about demands. I think you meant, were certain topics in demand at certain points, and can we chart that? That is a great question, and that is something that we want to answer with the help of our database and with the information that we collect there. I think at this point, no, we cannot answer it. But this is precisely what we want to achieve. To say really, right now we can just, people are counting manuscripts. Or Tawqa al-Mama, one manuscript's not in demand. They just think, oh, there are 100 manuscripts of it, so it was just a bestseller. But where was it actually a bestseller? In what period were these manuscripts produced, and who read them? Not everybody. So these are the questions that we want to answer, yes. And hopefully, but that will take a long time, a lot of material collection to achieve. Yes.
Thank you. There's some questions that have emerged. Let me see, or at least a comment by Neelam Hussain. I've come across whole groups of manuscripts destroyed by worms, larvae. In one of those cases, it was infestation of a whole group of manuscripts that were kept near each other. In another case was after a group were purchased and kept together in quarantine. That's just a note, not really a question. But Matthew Keegan has a question. This is fascinating, he writes. I'm wondering if you've seen that the people producing the manuscript notes that you are studying are active annotators and adding marginalia to the extent that this is clear from the hand of the scribe. Would this kind of linkage be noted in your database? And I was thinking the same thing about the khat, the actual script. Because I mean, in my work, there are certain notaries and certain judges whose khat is very clear to me when I encounter it. And that's what that counts as one of the concrete forms that your category for entry into the study of notes. It has to be concrete. It provides concrete information. And then another sort of critique, notion of the concrete is the paper itself, and especially watermarks. There's been an incredible study in Zabid, for example, in Yemen, of watermarks, which show exactly the same thing you're interested in, which is the trade networks in the books and paper, or probably going back and forth in those kind of trades, and it even goes into the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So these are two, yes, very important points. Watermarks are a great field of study. It's something that I do not do, but I would love to have a really overarching project like ours that concentrates on certain, we can't do everything, we're concentrating on manuscript notes, but something like that for watermarks would be amazing, yes. Or for paper in general. The previous question on the handwriting, yes, that's actually, I just wrote an article on that that is going to appear it will take a little time to appear, but where I just treat this particular question. It's because usually marginalia are so hard to put in context. I argue that manuscript notes can help because there we can connect the handwriting of a certain person with the marginalia that they have left in the manuscript. Usually these marginal handwritings are not clear enough to say, when we are looking at a sea of hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, where we can really see, oh, this is this one person. I do have, however, there are some people that I can just recognize by the handwriting, and that's what I will talk about in that article, where I can, where these things are not signed. So they are signed marginal notes, that give us some context. But even when they are not signed, sometimes I can see, oh, but I know the handwriting. This is clearly this guy, and then we can start thinking about the concrete context in which these marginal notes are. I will give an example that there will be a talk at the Institute for Advanced Studies next month, I believe, where we will talk about the Bibliotheca Arabica project, and there I will talk about these examples a little bit more.
We have a comment from Raja Khalidi, who's in Jerusalem, our interlocutor there, and his remark is possibly the way to understand watershed moments that were influential in the assembly over time of the manuscripts in the Khalidiyya by 1900 is to learn more about the lives of those Khalidis from Sunala onwards, who were possibly involved in collecting the manuscripts. Sheikh Musa and Sunala, who studied in Azhar, Muhammad Ali, a chief justice for the Ottomans, Yusuf Dia and Ruhi, who studied and worked in Istanbul and Vienna, Haj Ragib, friends from Bilad al-Shem, and Sheikh Khalil, who reached Al-Andalus.
Yes. These, I think that, the kind of, as I said, the kind of material that also Conrad is studying more in his project, to combine that with the manuscript notes, will enlighten, both sources can enlighten each other, definitely.
I have a question about the biographical dictionaries, which you mentioned as a source, and how, one of the things you were mentioning is also there was some poetry underneath a fiqh work, a jurisprudence work, I think, and that seemed to be something significant. When I read the biographies of jurists, they often have their poetry as part of the entry in the Tarajim and Tabaqat work. But so I'm interested in for the Khalidiyya, what are the main biographical dictionary sources? Are there numerous ones, or is it all by period? What?
You mean things that are in the Khalidiyya, or you?
No, just what are the relevant sources for the Khalidiyya, for example?
Well, well, first of all, what you were referring to earlier was the poem that he left under the Tawq al-Hamama. So to a poetic work, he answered with a poem, and then there was a legal note that he wrote in a legal manner. So he was kind of split character, and or it was in character in each book. But since you can expect manuscript notes from all periods and all places, you can't really limit the kind of sources that you use. If you have a book from Central Asia with previous owners from there, you would have to look in the sources there. And if you have to look, if you have something that comes from Bilad al-Sham, then you have the sources from that area, and you have to go by the period, by the area, but it's really limitless. That is a bit of a problem because you can't know everything.
And those works aren't digitized, are they?
I mean, you find on the internet, you find PDFs of edited biographical works and historical works, you know, en masse. Yeah, it's many are digitized. Sometimes you have access to digital copies of the manuscripts. So it's the normal, you know, it's the normal historical way of getting to identify these people. You know, it's if you're dealing with manuscripts from Yemen, you go to whatever historical works or biographical dictionaries were written in that area and in that period, and so you have to be flexible in that regard. And but it also means that to have a database that is open for suggestions from specialists in different areas and eras is obviously crucial, you know, because as I said, you can't know everything. Today with Google, you can find many people that without reading through you know, through the large tomes of or whole libraries, you know, but still, if you are it needs some specialization. I myself am more in the Mamluk and Ottoman period and more in Bilad al-Sham and in Egypt, but I have found myself going through you know, Tabakat works from the 4th century and Transoxania or whatever. You know, these are, you have to follow the source. And obviously, if you pool the resources and pool your experiences, then that would be much better than just a few people doing it or one person doing it.
Boris, you've revealed the dirty secret of our profession, which is the utility of Google.
Oh yes, I mean, is that we are among us here, right? This is not nobody's going to tell.
Marina, you had a question?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to actually jump the queue because Matt Keegan also has a very interesting question that will help me to frame mine.
Should we do Matt's first? So Matt, I'd like to follow up on the document note that Conrad Hirschler mentioned last time, in which someone had reconstructed a manuscript of a commentary on the Maqamat that had been dispersed. This is clear from a manuscript note. Where does this sort of note fit in your typology of notes? How common was this practice according to your survey of the manuscripts so far?
This is something that you find a lot in the Khalidiyya, and only, as far as I know, in the Khalidiyya. So this is only one person who has done some reconstruction work. It's apparently from this dasht where fragments and discarded manuscripts were, and he apparently took them out of there. And I don't know what he did. He doesn't specify. He just says, you know, there were ashtat, there were, you know, fragmentary and dispersed, and he put them together again and probably bound them and had it so that they could be put on a normal bookshelf. That's how I understand this note. It's always the same note, the exact same wording in like, I don't know, in like half of, not half, maybe a quarter of the manuscripts have them. And so at a certain point, I think it's always dated, it's Muharram 1309 that it is dated. And so at this point, he has done some work to make these things accessible again. In what way? Some of these, by the way, this is not only for things what you would imagine to be fragments, and you know, some of the very beautiful manuscripts were in the dasht apparently. Some of these Sultanic manuscripts that I showed were in the dasht and were taken out of him by him and restituted to the library in some way that he doesn't specify really. But this is something that is unique to this library. And we see that in the 20th century, people were writing different things than in previous, you know, the things they were referring to other libraries, they were referring to other kinds of works. So this is nothing that I have seen in any other context.
Marina, do you have a final question?
Yeah, so this is fascinating to me, the whole question of reconstitution of manuscripts and also splitting apart of manuscripts. Partly because I work with fragments that, you know, often you can actually succeed in joining, which is like the best feeling in the world. But there was also some reconstitution or constitution, I should say, of codices going on even back in the day. So I worked with a manuscript from around 1200 that was two separate texts by two different authors. in the hand of the same scribe, and the paper sizes were slightly different. And you could see that the larvae holes only went through one of the texts and not through the other text, but they were on the same paper. So there was something going on here where somebody had put these two manuscripts together into a single codex and then also trimmed part of the margins. So I'm curious about every stage of this, like, you know, how much margin trimming do you see? Do you see marginalia that have been cut through and cut off? And how much splitting apart of text? I mean, we know that that happens all the time, but also how many majmu'at were not originally majmu'at, but were just kind of like put together later?
Oh yeah, so yeah, it's a lot in there. Where to start? The majmu'at are, there are two kinds in modern scholarship. The multi-text manuscripts, that is, you know, one scribe writing several texts, smaller text into one volume, and it's meant to be a volume. And there are the majmu'as that are composite manuscripts. You have several things, and then you at a certain point you decide, oh, they should all be in one volume, and then you know, you do that. And yes, the trimming of margins in that when things are being bound is so common. You find that pretty much you know, in any other manuscript. It's a lot of that, yeah, and the margins are the place that tell you that. So that's because it's otherwise, you know, when you have a binding and then it's trimmed and it fits, you know, and it all looks good, but the margins tell you, oh, this used to be bigger. So that's very, very common. The splitting up of manuscripts is something that you can, where the manuscript notes can help you reestablish the connections. Yes, that's and that is something that we can do today, and will be much more able to do in the future when all that material is collected, and we can see this. So this was a multi-volume thing, and one volume now is in Istanbul, and one volume is in Paris, and one volume is in Cairo. Yeah, it's pretty usual. And the manuscript notes can also tell you when that happened, because sometimes they tell you, oh, I bought this book and the volume that was before it and the volume that was after it, and then you see also at this point they were still together, and then so they must have split up at the later point. So yeah, there's a lot of that needs to be where you need a lot of detective work to connect these threads, indeed.
Boris Librence and Marina Rustow, this is an amazing encounter with real detectives. Manuscript written detectives. I mean, fantastic. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks,
Marina, for your comments and the great questions. And
a pleasure, as always.
Thanks so much. Okay, I think we can sort of adjourn this session. We'll see you shortly in another readings from the Khalidiyya.